Stay right there, don't move. It's dangerous. Adrian Marino stopped with his hand resting lightly on the back of the chair, his coat still folded neatly over his arm. He turned toward Nina slowly, not startled, just curious the way someone looks when something unexpected interrupts a familiar routine. "I'm sorry," he said, voice calm but slightly lower than usual. Nina kept her tone quiet, almost casual, as if she were commenting on the weather rather than warning a man about possible danger. "The two men who came in earlier, they're not really here to eat," she said gently. "They've been watching the entrance the whole time. I think they're waiting for you to walk out." Adrian's eyes held hers for a moment, searching for hesitation, for exaggeration, anything that might suggest she was mistaken. "What makes you think that?" he asked. "They came in about 15 minutes before you," Nina replied. "Didn't even open the menus. One keeps touching his ear like he's checking something. Maybe an earpiece. The other hasn't looked at anything, except the front door." Adrian gave the smallest glance toward the window beside the table, careful enough that no one else would notice. "And you picked up on all that just walking past?" he asked. Nina gave a faint shrug. "It's part of the job. You notice things when you've been doing this long enough." He studied her expression more closely now. "You always watch people this carefully?" he asked. "I don't mean to," Nina said, allowing the smallest apologetic smile. "But after a while you start noticing patterns. Who's celebrating something? Who's arguing? Who's about to send their steak back?" Adrian's gaze sharpened slightly. "Or who might be planning something worse than complaining about dinner," he said quietly. "Yes," Nina admitted softly. He leaned one hand on the table, thoughtful. "You could be wrong," he said. "I could," she agreed. "And if you are, you just stopped a customer on his way out for no reason." "I know," Nina said. "I thought about that." Adrian tilted his head slightly. "So why say anything at all?" Nina hesitated for half a second, choosing honesty over something rehearsed. "Because they came in before you did." Adrian's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes became more alert. "You seem pretty sure of that. They didn't even pretend to be interested in the menu," Nina said gently. "People who plan to eat usually look at the food." That earned the faintest exhale from Adrian. Not quite a laugh, not quite agreement. "And you're certain they're focused on me?" he asked. "Yes." "How?" "They follow your reflection," she said quietly. "In the glass near the host stand. Every time you move, one of them adjusts in his chair." Adrian paused. "You've been watching me too, then?" he said. "Only because they were," Nina answered calmly. That response seemed to ease something in him. Still, suspicion remained. "You understand how this sounds," he said. "A waitress suddenly warning me about strangers she's been studying." "I do. You could be part of whatever this is." Nina nodded once. "That crossed my mind too," she admitted. "If I were in your position, I'd wonder the same thing." Adrian watched her carefully. "Then help me understand why you'd warn me," he said. Nina glanced briefly toward the entrance, keeping the movement natural. "Because if someone wanted to cause trouble inside, they'd already have done it," she said. "They're waiting for you to step outside." Adrian considered that. "Did they speak to any staff?" he asked. "No." "Order drinks? Water? Pay attention to anything besides the door?" "No." Adrian nodded slowly. Outside the window, a dark SUV sat across the street with the engine running quietly. He adjusted the cuff of his shirt, using the reflection in the glass to confirm what Nina had already seen. "They came prepared," he said softly. "That was my impression," Nina replied. Adrian rested his hand lightly on the table again, thoughtful but composed. "How long have you worked here?" he asked. 7 years. "You've been serving me for, what, 3? "Just about. And in 3 years, you've never warned me about anything." "There hasn't been anything to warn you about." He gave a faint nod, accepting that answer. "What did you do before this?" he asked. "I studied accounting," Nina said. "Didn't finish." "Why not?" "My mother got sick." Adrian's expression softened slightly, not with sympathy, but with recognition. "Life changes plans," he said quietly. "Yes," Nina agreed. He looked once more toward the entrance, using the reflection in the glass. The two men remained still. "You realize," Adrian said gently, "if you're right about this, tonight may become more complicated than either of us planned." "I assumed that," Nina replied. "And if you're wrong, then I apologize for interrupting your evening." Adrian almost smiled at that. "Fair enough," He placed a few folded bills beneath the receipt folder without counting. "Walk normally," he said quietly. "Do what you'd usually do. Don't look at them again." Nina nodded. "Of course." She picked up an empty glass from a nearby table, movement steady and natural. "And Nina," Adrian added softly. She paused. "Yes? Thank you for saying something." She gave a small nod. "I hope I'm wrong," she said. "So do I," Adrian replied. Nina walked calmly back toward the service station, forcing herself not to glance toward the entrance again. Routine protected appearances. Across the room, the two men pretended to study menus they had no interest in reading. Outside, the SUV engine continued idling quietly. Nina Walker had built her life on noticing small details most people overlooked. Tonight, one of those details might change everything. Adrian did not leave the restaurant immediately. Instead, he sat back down as though nothing unusual had happened, adjusting the cuff of his shirt with the same quiet composure Nina had observed countless times before. From a distance, he appeared no different from any other guest lingering over the last sip of an expensive drink. But Nina sensed the shift. Something in his posture had changed. Still calm, but more deliberate, more aware. She moved through the dining room with practiced rhythm, refilling water glasses, clearing plates, and exchanging polite smiles with guests who had no idea how quickly an ordinary evening could turn fragile. Every movement she made felt slightly sharper now, as if the air itself had become thinner. At the service station, her co-worker Daniel was polishing cutlery, humming softly under his breath. He had worked at La Rosa Grigio for nearly 20 years, and treated the job with the quiet pride of someone who understood consistency was its own kind of achievement. "You okay?" Daniel asked casually, noticing Nina had paused a moment longer than usual. "Just tired," she replied, keeping her tone even. "Long week," he nodded knowingly. "Happens to all of us." Nina gave a small smile and returned to stacking plates. The ordinary exchange grounded her more than she expected. The world outside their quiet dining room could contain danger, betrayal, violence. But here, someone still cared whether the forks were polished correctly. Across the room, Adrian lifted his glass slowly, pretending to examine the bourbon's color under candlelight. His attention, however, remained directed toward reflections in the darkened window beside him. Nina followed his line of sight only once, using the mirrored surface of the espresso machine to avoid turning her head directly. The two men had not moved. One leaned slightly forward, forearms resting loosely on the table, posture relaxed but alert. The other appeared to be reading something on his phone, though the screen remained dark. At 8:31 p.m., the dinner rush softened. Several tables requested checks. Chairs shifted quietly across polished floors. The host began preparing reservations for the late seating. Routine continued, uninterrupted on the surface. Nina approached table 12 carrying a small tray with a glass of water she had not been asked to bring. "Still no order from them," she said quietly as she placed the glass beside Adrian's untouched napkin. "They're patient," Adrian replied. "Yes, patient men rarely come without a reason." Nina adjusted the silverware slightly, careful not to appear engaged in conversation. "I noticed something else," she said gently. Adrian did not look at her. "Go on." "They didn't arrive together," she continued. "One came in first. The second followed about 30 seconds later." "That matters?" Adrian asked. "Usually," Nina said softly. "People meeting for dinner walk in together." Adrian nodded almost imperceptibly. "Spacing suggests coordination," he murmured. "Yes. Anything else?" "The taller one scanned the emergency exit before sitting," Nina said, like he was confirming where it was. Adrian exhaled slowly. "That confirms enough," he said. Nina hesitated briefly before stepping away. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Adrian folded the napkin once, calmly. "We wait." "For what?" "For them to make a mistake." Nina returned to the service station, her pulse steady but heightened. Waiting sounded simple, but waiting meant uncertainty, and uncertainty had rarely been kind in her life. At 8:40 p.m., the restaurant manager, Mr. Holloway, stepped out of his office, reviewing invoices on a tablet. He paused briefly to greet guests, maintaining the polished professionalism that had kept La Rosa Grigio respected for decades. "Nina," he said quietly as she passed. "Everything running smoothly tonight?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Mr. Marino seems comfortable?" "Yes." Mr. Holloway gave a satisfied nod. Adrian Marino was known as a valuable customer. not simply because of generous tipping, but because his presence attracted other discreet clientele who appreciated environments where privacy was protected. Comfort, however, was no longer the appropriate word. Nina continued moving naturally between tables, but her awareness remained anchored to the entrance. Each time the door opened, her muscles tightened slightly before relaxing again. At 8:47 p.m., the shorter of the two men stood and walked toward the restroom, passing within 3 feet of Adrian's table. His eyes did not linger, yet Nina sensed calculation behind the casual movement. Adrian's hand remained resting lightly beside his glass, relaxed but prepared. The man returned less than a minute later and resumed his seat without speaking to his companion. Adrian reached for his phone but did not unlock the screen. "No signal," he said quietly when Nina passed again. "Jammer?" she asked softly. "Possibly." Nina absorbed that information without reaction. "You're very calm," Adrian observed. "I learned not to panic unless panic helps," she replied. "And does it?" "Not usually." Adrian almost smiled. "You're not what I expected when I first started coming here," he said. "I hope that's not a complaint." "Not at all." Nina refilled the water glass. "What did you expect?" she asked. "Someone who saw only plates and tips," Adrian said. "I see plenty of those," Nina replied. "And tonight?" "Tonight I see something that doesn't belong." Adrian nodded once. At 8:55 p.m., a couple near the entrance stood to leave, momentarily blocking the line of sight between Adrian and the two men. The taller man shifted slightly in his chair, adjusting position to regain visual contact. Small movement, clear intention. "They don't want obstacles," Nina said quietly as she collected empty plates. "No," Adrian agreed. "They expected a clear exit." "Yes." Nina paused briefly beside the service station, considering her next words carefully. "There's a service corridor behind the wine cellar," she said softly when she returned. "It connects to the delivery entrance." Adrian looked up at her directly for the first time since she had spoken the warning. "You're offering escape routes now?" "I'm offering information," Nina corrected gently. "You've thought about this already." "I prefer options." Adrian studied her carefully. "You surprised me," he admitted. "That wasn't my intention." "No," Adrian said quietly. "But it may be useful." Nina stepped away again, allowing distance to maintain appearances. At 9:03 p.m., the two men exchanged a brief glance. Nina felt certainty settle deeper in her chest. "They're expecting movement soon," she said softly as she passed table 12 once more. Adrian placed his napkin beside the glass. "So are we," he replied. Nina did not yet know how deeply she had become involved, but she understood one thing clearly. This night would not end with routine conversation and folded receipts. Something had already shifted beyond repair, and once certain lines were crossed, returning to invisibility was no longer possible. If this story touched you, tell me where you're watching from. I truly enjoy seeing how far Nina's journey reaches. Don't hesitate to press like to show your support for Nina, and leave her a heart in the comments, so she knows she's not alone. Subscribe to the channel and stay with us for more stories where courage speaks softly, but justice speaks loud. By 9:07 p.m., the restaurant had thinned enough that individual movements became easier to track. Conversations softened, plates disappeared, and the quiet elegance of La Rosa Grigio began transitioning into the slower rhythm of late evening service. Nina continued her work with measured precision, but every sense remained alert. Adrian stayed seated, appearing patient, almost relaxed, though Nina could now recognize the difference between calm and calculation. He was not waiting passively. He was studying timing. The two men near the entrance had shifted positions again, subtly adjusting their chairs to maintain a clear line of sight toward table 12. Neither had touched the water placed before them. One rested his wrist lightly on the table, fingers relaxed but ready. The other scanned reflections in the window each time the front door opened. They were not amateurs. Nina approached table 6 with a tray of espresso cups, allowing herself a brief glance toward the entrance through the reflection in the polished metal coffee dispenser. The taller man checked his watch, not casually, but with purpose. "They're coordinating with someone outside," she said quietly as she returned to Adrian's table with the bill folder. "Likely," Adrian replied without looking up. "They expected you to leave by now. I sometimes stay longer." "Do they know that?" "They will." Nina placed the bill folder on the table without opening it. "There's a couple celebrating a birthday near the window," she said, her voice neutral. "They'll probably ask for photos soon. That might block the entrance briefly." Adrian's eyes lifted toward her. "You're planning timing," he observed. "I'm recognizing opportunity," she replied gently. He gave a faint nod. "That service corridor you mentioned," Adrian said quietly. "How often is it used?" "Delivery staff use it twice a night," Nina replied. "But after 9, it's usually empty." "Alarm Ed?" "No. Only the exterior door has a security sensor." Adrian leaned back slightly in his chair, absorbing the information. "And the kitchen?" "2 staff left early," Nina said. "Dishwasher is still here, but he rarely leaves his station." "Manager?" "In the office." Adrian's gaze moved briefly across the dining room again. "Anyone who might notice something unusual?" "Only if we make it obvious." That answer lingered between them for a moment. At 9:12 p.m., the birthday couple Nina had mentioned stood near the front entrance, while a friend attempted to capture the perfect photograph under the restaurant's soft lighting. Their laughter filled the small space briefly, creating a natural barrier between the two men and the door. The shorter man shifted again, clearly irritated by the obstruction. "They don't like variables," Nina said quietly. "No," Adrian agreed. "Which means they may accelerate." Nina felt the weight of that word. Things could move quickly now. She collected an empty glass from the adjacent table. Her posture relaxed despite the tension building beneath the surface. "What happens if they come inside?" she asked quietly. "They won't," Adrian said. "You're certain?" "If the objective is clean, they prefer distance." Nina absorbed that calmly. "So they want you outside?" "Yes." "And alone?" "Yes." Nina folded a linen napkin slowly, considering the implications. "There's a blind spot near the wine cellar entrance," she said after a moment. "Security camera angle doesn't cover it fully." Adrian looked at her again. "You know the camera layout." "I've worked double shifts for years," Nina said. "You learn where not to spill things." A faint breath of amusement touched Adrian's expression. "That may be the most practical explanation I've heard all evening." Nina allowed herself the smallest smile. "I try to keep solutions practical." At 9:16 p.m., the taller man stood, adjusting his coat slightly as he walked toward the host stand, pretending to ask a question about reservations. His voice remained polite, but Nina noticed how his eyes scanned the dining room's depth without appearing obvious. "He's confirming layout," she murmured as she passed Adrian's table again. Adrian lifted his glass as if finishing the last sip of bourbon. "They're running out of patience," he said quietly. "So are you," Nina replied. "Yes." The taller man returned to his seat, speaking briefly to his companion in a voice too low to hear. Nina's instincts sharpened further. "They expected less delay," she said. "They expected routine," Adrian corrected. "And now?" "Now they're adjusting." Nina paused near the service station, her thoughts aligning carefully. "My shift ends at 10, she said quietly when she returned. "Staff usually exit through the delivery corridor." Adrian understood immediately. "Blending movement," he said. "Yes. You would still be visible to them." "Not if I leave with others." "And me?" "You would not leave with others." Adrian watched her carefully. "You are suggesting I follow a waitress through a service corridor," he said. "I'm suggesting no one watches the help closely," Nina replied calmly. That answer lingered. "You're very certain of that," Adrian said. "It's how I've lived for 7 years." The truth in her voice carried quiet weight. Adrian considered the risk. "You realize this involves you further than you intended," he said. "I realized that when I spoke to you," Nina replied. "And yet you continue." "Yes." "Why?" Nina hesitated briefly before answering. "Because if someone is willing to wait this long to harm you," she said, "they are unlikely to ignore the person who warned you." Adrian nodded slowly. "Fair point." At 9:22 p.m., the shorter man checked his watch again. A silent signal passed between the two. "They'll move soon," Nina said quietly. "Then so will we," Adrian replied. He stood slowly, not abruptly, simply a man preparing to leave after dinner. Routine movement. Expected behavior. Nina collected his glass as though completing her duties. "I'll clear this," she said softly. Adrian adjusted his coat over his arm. "You walk ahead," he murmured. Nina nodded. As she moved toward the hallway leading to the service corridor, she felt the shift fully settle into place. This was no longer observation. This was participation. Behind her, Adrian followed at a natural distance, neither hurried nor hesitant. Across the dining room, the two men stood almost simultaneously. They had noticed. The timing had begun. Nina did not look back again. The corridor ahead appeared exactly as it always had, narrow, quiet, lined with stacked crates and folded linens waiting for morning delivery. Exactly the kind of place no one important ever looked twice, which was precisely why it might keep them alive. The service corridor behind La Rosa Grigio felt colder than the dining room, as though the warmth of candlelight refused to travel past the heavy double doors separating guests from the machinery that kept their evening effortless. Nina pushed the door open with controlled ease, holding a small tray in one hand to maintain the appearance of routine. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, illuminating stainless steel shelves, stacked with folded linens and crates of unopened wine. She did not slow her pace. Behind her, she could hear Adrian's footsteps steady, measured, matching her rhythm without crowding her space. Anyone glancing briefly would assume he was a guest asking for directions or perhaps a manager reviewing inventory. Exactly what they needed. "You walk this way every night?" Adrian asked quietly. "Usually 3 times, Nina replied without turning. "Once to check deliveries, once to restock glassware, once to leave. And tonight? Tonight it's useful." Adrian gave a quiet hum of acknowledgement. "How far does this corridor go?" "To the rear loading area," Nina said. "There's a side exit before that. Camera coverage? One near the kitchen door. One at the exterior exit. Blind spots?" "Yes." Adrian allowed the smallest hint of approval in his expression. "You've thought about this before," he said. "I've worked here long enough to know where people don't look," Nina answered simply. They reached the narrow bend in the corridor where the ceiling lowered slightly due to ventilation ducts. Nina slowed just enough to appear natural, setting the tray onto a stainless steel cart positioned against the wall. "This is the blind spot," she said quietly. "Camera angle cuts off here." Adrian stepped closer, careful to remain outside the direct view of the corridor entrance. "You are very calm," he observed. "I'm focused," Nina corrected. "Fear usually interferes with focus. I'll deal with fear later." Adrian's gaze lingered on her for a brief moment, assessing whether her composure came from courage or necessity. "Do you often help strangers escape danger?" he asked. "Not usually," Nina replied. "Then why tonight?" Nina adjusted the folded linen on the cart, aligning its edges instinctively. "Because whoever is waiting outside didn't look uncertain," she said quietly. "They looked prepared." Adrian nodded once. "That they did." Footsteps sounded faintly behind the kitchen door. Nina glanced toward the handle but did not move away from the cart. "Dishwasher finishing his shift," she said softly. "He leaves through the other exit." Adrian listened carefully, confirming the rhythm of movement beyond the door. "Timing matters," he murmured. "Yes." Nina continued down the corridor, maintaining a steady pace until they reached the service elevator alcove. The elevator itself was rarely used during late hours, reserved mostly for early morning deliveries. "The stairwell is quieter," she said. "Less chance of interruption." Adrian followed without hesitation. Inside the stairwell, the air smelled faintly of cleaning solution and concrete dust. The muted echo of their footsteps created the impression of distance from the warm elegance of the dining room they had left behind. "How many exits from this building?" Adrian asked. "2 public," Nina replied. "1 delivery, 1 emergency." "And you believe they're watching the public exits?" "Yes." "You didn't notice anyone near the alley?" "No." Adrian paused briefly at the landing between floors. "They may have coverage outside our view," he said. "They probably do. And yet you're still confident in this route." "I'm confident no one expects you to follow a waitress through a service stairwell," Nina replied. Adrian allowed the faintest trace of a smile. "That may be true." They descended 1 more level before Nina slowed again near the metal door leading to the delivery corridor. She pressed her hand lightly against the surface, listening. She opened the door carefully. Cool air drifted inside, carrying the faint scent of rain and asphalt. The loading area was dimly lit, illuminated only by a single security lamp near the rear gate. A delivery truck sat parked several spaces down, its driver nowhere in sight. "Too quiet." Nina stepped forward slowly, scanning the shadows. "This area is usually empty after 9, she said. Adrian moved beside her, posture relaxed but alert. "Usually," he repeated. "Yes." He studied the surrounding buildings, the angle of the alleyway, the distance to the street beyond. "They would expect me to exit through the main entrance," he said. "Yes, which means their attention is likely focused there." "That was my thought." Adrian considered the possibilities carefully. "You realize if they identify you as involved, your situation becomes complicated," he said. "I assumed that when I spoke to you." And yet you continued. Yes. Adrian regarded her with quiet curiosity. You don't appear reckless. I'm not. Then why accept the risk? Nina folded her arms lightly, not defensively, simply thoughtful. Because I don't think they would ignore me, she said honestly. I spoke to you long enough for them to notice. Adrian acknowledged the logic. Possibly, he said. Probably, Nina corrected gently. A faint sound echoed from the far end of the alley, a car passing on the adjacent street. Both of them remained still until the sound faded. You've done this before, Adrian said quietly. No, Nina replied. But I've been underestimated before. Adrian considered that answer carefully. Underestimation can be dangerous, he said. Sometimes useful, Nina replied. A brief silence followed. You understand, Adrian said calmly. Once we leave this building, the situation becomes less predictable. I understand. And if they are positioned farther out, then we adjust. Adrian gave a small nod. You speak like someone familiar with contingency. I speak like someone who has had plans fail before, Nina replied. That seemed to resonate. Adrian checked the alley once more before stepping forward. Stay slightly behind me, he said quietly. Nina hesitated only a fraction of a second. You might want to stay slightly behind me, she said. You stand out more than I do. Adrian almost laughed at that. Fair point. They moved together toward the shadowed end of the alley, keeping their pace unhurried. From the street beyond, distant headlights passed intermittently, casting brief reflections against the damp pavement. Yet neither of them relaxed, because absence of danger did not guarantee safety. It simply meant the next move had not yet been revealed. Halfway to the corner, Nina slowed slightly. There's usually a linen delivery truck around this time, she said quietly. Reliable? Adrian asked. Very. Predictable schedules create opportunity, he said. Yes. They reached the corner where the alley met the side street. The glow of traffic lights reflected faintly against wet asphalt. The city continued moving normally, unaware of the silent calculations unfolding within it. Adrian glanced briefly toward the main avenue, where headlights passed steadily. No sign of the SUV from here, he noted. They wouldn't park twice in the same place, Nina said. Adrian regarded her thoughtfully. You notice more than most people, he said. I've had practice. A faint rumble of an approaching vehicle echoed from the far end of the street. Nina recognized the sound immediately. That should be the linen truck, she said quietly. Adrian nodded. Then we move naturally, he said. Yes. The truck turned the corner slowly, tires hissing softly against damp pavement as it approached the loading zone behind the adjacent building. As the vehicle came to a stop, Nina exhaled slowly. One step at a time. That was how survival often worked. One ordinary movement at a time. Behind them, somewhere beyond view, two patient men were still waiting for Adrian Marino to walk out the front door. They did not yet know he had chosen another path. The linen truck rolled to a slow stop beside the service entrance of the neighboring building, its engine idling with a steady mechanical hum that sounded almost comforting after the tension of the last hour. Nina recognized the driver immediately. Stan had been handling late-night deliveries for nearly as long as she had worked at La Rosa Grigio. He was a quiet man in his late 50s who listened to old rock through oversized headphones and rarely spoke more than necessary. Predictability made him dependable. Timing works, Nina said softly. Adrian remained half a step behind her, his posture relaxed enough to avoid attention but alert enough to respond instantly if something shifted. Does he usually check paperwork? Adrian asked. Never, Nina replied. He drops linens, picks up bags, leaves. Good. Stan climbed down from the driver's seat, stretching his back briefly before opening the rear doors of the truck. He did not notice Nina at first, focused instead on adjusting the stack of canvas carts inside. Evening, Stan, Nina said calmly, approaching with the same tone she used during every routine delivery. Stan slid one headphone halfway off his ear. Hey Nina, he said. Quiet night? Pretty normal, she replied. Stan nodded, satisfied with the predictable answer. Got 3 carts for you tonight. Manager said you were running low on tablecloths. That sounds right, Nina said. Stan stepped aside, pulling one of the rolling carts down the metal ramp. The wheels rattled softly against the steel grooves, the sound echoing faintly through the alley. Adrian remained just outside the pool of light cast by the overhead lamp, appearing no more suspicious than any customer waiting for directions. Stan barely glanced in his direction. Delivery company subcontractor, Nina said casually, gesturing toward Adrian with a natural ease that required no elaboration. Stan gave a polite nod without curiosity. "Cold night for paperwork," he said absently. Adrian returned the nod. "Just finishing a long day." Stan accepted that explanation without interest. Routine had taught him not to ask questions that complicated his schedule. As Stan returned to the truck for the second cart, Nina moved closer to Adrian. "He won't remember you," she said quietly. "That helps," Adrian replied. Stan rolled the second cart down the ramp, positioning it near the service entrance. "Everything else same as last week?" he asked Nina. "Yes," she answered. "Pick up at 3? 3 sharp." Stan wiped his hands on a folded cloth tucked into his back pocket. "You look tired," he added kindly. "Long shift," Nina said. "Tell me about it." Stan chuckled softly before climbing back into the truck to retrieve the final cart. Adrian observed the interaction carefully. "He trusts familiarity," he murmured. "Most people do," Nina replied. The third cart came down the ramp more slowly, its wheels squeaking faintly. Stan adjusted its alignment before closing the truck doors with a heavy metallic thud. "All set," he said. "See you Thursday." "Drive safe," Nina replied. Stan replaced his headphones, already absorbed again in whatever music carried him through long overnight routes. He climbed into the cab and started the engine, reversing carefully toward the exit of the narrow loading zone. As the truck pulled away, the alley returned to quiet stillness. Adrian exhaled slowly. "That worked," he said. "For now," Nina replied. They remained still for a moment, listening for any unusual movement beyond the alley. Nothing. Only distant traffic and the faint hum of the city settling into late evening rhythm. Adrian stepped slightly closer to the shadow of the building, reducing his visibility from the street. "You've done this job a long time," he said. "Yes. Long enough to know routines can be useful." "Routines are often invisible," Nina replied. "And invisibility is power," Adrian said. "Sometimes," she agreed. Adrian studied the alley once more before shifting his attention back to her. "You understand that whoever arranged this had access to my schedule," he said quietly. "Yes. Very few people know where I dine regularly." Nina considered that. "Then whoever told them had time to observe patterns," she said. Adrian nodded slightly. "Or someone close to me shared the information directly." "People talk more than they realize," Nina said. "That they do." He paused briefly, considering the implications. "You noticed the men quickly," he said, "which suggests they were not subtle." "They didn't need to be subtle," Nina replied. "They expected routine." Adrian's gaze sharpened slightly. "Routine creates vulnerability." "And predictability," Nina added. Adrian gave a faint nod. "Yes." A light drizzle began to fall, thin droplets tapping softly against metal surfaces and darkening the pavement beneath their feet. "We shouldn't remain here long," Adrian said. "No," Nina agreed. "Where do you normally go after your shift?" "Home," she replied. "Alone?" "Yes." Adrian considered that carefully. "That may not be advisable tonight." "I assumed that," Nina said. "You may have been observed speaking with me." "Yes. And if the objective is elimination of risk, I become a loose end," Nina finished calmly. Adrian regarded her for a moment. "You accept that possibility rather easily." "I prefer clarity," Nina replied. "That is a useful trait." The rain intensified slightly, softening sounds from the street. Adrian stepped beneath the partial cover of the adjacent loading dock awning. "There is a temporary apartment nearby," he said. "Secure, discreet." Nina did not respond immediately. "You're offering protection," she said finally. "I'm offering practicality." "And if I refuse?" "You accept additional risk." Nina considered the situation carefully. Her apartment was less than 15 minutes away by car. "Whoever planned tonight expects consistency," she said quietly. "Yes. Then going home immediately may not be wise." Adrian nodded once. "Agreed." Nina folded her arms lightly, not defensive, simply thoughtful. "This wasn't how I expected my shift to end," she said. "I imagine not," Adrian replied. "You don't seem surprised." "I am rarely surprised," he said calmly. "That sounds exhausting." Adrian allowed the faintest hint of amusement. "It can be." They stood quietly for a brief moment, rain continuing its steady rhythm against pavement. "You helped me tonight," Adrian said. "I noticed something unusual," Nina corrected, "and chose to act." "Yes, that distinction matters." Nina met his gaze evenly. "I didn't want someone walking into danger if I could prevent it." Adrian studied her carefully. Most people prefer not to become involved. Most people prefer safety. And you? I prefer to sleep at night, she said simply. Adrian nodded once, accepting the answer without comment. A black sedan passed slowly at the far end of the street, its headlights briefly illuminating the edge of the alley before continuing onward. Yet neither of them assumed safety, because those who waited patiently rarely abandoned plans easily. Come, Adrian said quietly. Where? Somewhere less predictable. Nina hesitated only briefly before nodding. Predictable routines had nearly placed Adrian directly in harm's way. Tonight, unpredictability offered better odds. As they moved toward the quieter side street, the rain softened the sound of their footsteps, blending them into the ordinary rhythm of the city. Behind them, La Rosa Grigio continued its evening service, as though nothing unusual had occurred. Candles still burned, wine still poured, conversations still unfolded, and two men near the entrance were still waiting for a man who had already chosen another path. The rain had settled into a steady rhythm by the time Adrian guided Nina toward a dark sedan parked half a block away. The vehicle blended easily with others lining the quiet street, its understated design attracting no unnecessary attention. Adrian opened the passenger door without ceremony, scanning the reflections in nearby windows before allowing her to enter first. The interior smelled faintly of leather and something clean, subtle, almost medicinal. Nothing personal, nothing decorative. It was a car meant for movement, not comfort. You keep emergency cars nearby? Nina asked as she fastened the seatbelt. I keep options, Adrian replied simply. He started the engine without turning on the headlights immediately, allowing the dashboard to illuminate softly while he checked the mirrors. You always assume the worst? Nina asked. I assume preparation prevents regret, Adrian said. The headlights came on only after he had confirmed the street remained quiet. They pulled away smoothly, merging into the slow-moving flow of evening traffic. The rain blurred reflections of streetlights across the windshield, creating shifting patterns of gold and red that distorted distance and softened details. Nina watched the passing storefronts without fully seeing them. Her mind remained fixed on the sequence of events that had unfolded within the last 2 hours. I suppose this is the part where I realize my evening didn't go as planned, she said quietly. Adrian glanced at her briefly before returning his attention to the road. I imagine it did not, he said. I was supposed to stop by the grocery store after work. Nina added lightly. Cat food. Laundry detergent. Very dramatic plans. That may need to wait, Adrian replied. Yes, she said. It appears so. They drove in silence for several blocks before Nina spoke again. Whoever set this up knew your routine, she said. That doesn't happen by accident. No, Adrian agreed. And they were confident enough to wait openly. Yes, that suggests they expected success. Adrian turned onto a quieter avenue lined with older buildings. Confidence can come from inside information, he said. Someone you trust, Nina said. Possibly. Or someone who observes patterns closely. Adrian gave a faint nod. You think this required long-term planning? Yes, Nina said. They didn't improvise tonight. The car slowed at a red light. Rain tapped steadily against the roof. People underestimate how much service staff notice, Nina continued. They assume we hear conversations, but don't understand them. And you do understand them? Adrian asked. Enough, she said. Numbers, timing, tone, things tend to align. You studied accounting, Adrian recalled. Yes. Why not finish? Nina watched the red traffic signal reflect across the hood of the car. My mother got sick, she said simply. Plans changed. Adrian did not respond immediately. They often do, he said quietly. The light turned green. They continued driving. The neighborhood gradually shifted from busy commercial blocks to quieter residential streets lined with brick buildings and narrow balconies. Adrian slowed as they approached a corner structure with minimal exterior lighting. This is temporary, he said as he pulled into an underground parking entrance. The gate opened automatically as the vehicle approached, revealing a small private garage lit by motion-sensitive lights. You trust technology, Nina observed. I trust layers, Adrian corrected. The car came to a stop near a private elevator entrance. This building belongs to a holding company, Adrian said. Few tenants, minimal traffic. Nina stepped out, the cool air carrying the faint scent of concrete and rain-soaked pavement. Inside the elevator, silence felt heavier. You do realize I don't usually accept invitations from customers, Nina said. This is not a social invitation, Adrian replied. I assumed that. The elevator opened directly into a minimalist apartment. Neutral tones, clean lines, practical furniture. The space looked lived in only occasionally, as if used between departures rather than for daily routine. Adrian locked the door behind them and checked the security panel mounted near the entrance. Monitored, he said quietly. Nina moved slowly through the room, observing details without intruding. No photographs, she noted. No. No personal items. Nothing traceable. Nina nodded slightly. That makes sense. Adrian removed his jacket and placed it neatly over the back of a chair. You may sit, he said. Nina remained standing a moment longer. You're certain they followed your usual exit expectations? She asked. Yes. Then they will assume delay or change of plans, she said thoughtfully. Which buys time, Adrian replied. For both of us. Adrian studied her expression carefully. You understand this situation connects you to events beyond your profession, he said. I realized that when I decided to speak, Nina answered calmly. You could have remained silent. Yes. Most would have. Most people don't like complications. And you? I don't like regrets. That answer lingered. Adrian gestured toward a chair near the window. Sit, he repeated, softer this time. Nina sat, resting her hands lightly in her lap. What happens now? She asked. I determine who provided information, Adrian said. You already have suspicions. Yes. And, if you're correct, then resolution follows. Nina nodded slowly. Justice, she said quietly. Adrian considered the word. Justice is rarely simple, he replied. No, Nina agreed. But betrayal usually is. Adrian's gaze sharpened slightly. You speak as someone familiar with betrayal. Marriage teaches many useful lessons, Nina said lightly. Adrian allowed the smallest trace of a smile. Experience can be instructive. Yes. He moved toward a cabinet and retrieved a glass of water, placing it on the table near her. You should drink, he said. Nina accepted the glass. Thank you. Adrian remained standing, thoughtful. You are observant, he said. I pay attention. You remain calm under pressure. I tree. You chose involvement knowing risk increases. Yes. Adrian nodded once. Then we proceed carefully. Nina exhaled slowly. For the record, she said quietly, this is the strangest Tuesday I've had in years. Adrian allowed a faint breath of amusement. Strange evenings often reveal important truths. I hope that includes surviving them, Nina replied. That is usually the objective. Outside, rain continued falling steadily against the darkened windows. The city moved on, unaware of the quiet calculations unfolding behind reinforced glass. Two strangers who had shared only polite conversation hours earlier now sat in the stillness of an unfamiliar apartment. Connected by coincidence, instinct, and a danger neither had originally expected to face together. And somewhere across the city, someone was likely realizing that a carefully constructed plan had not unfolded as intended. The rain continued through the night, soft against the tall windows, muting the sounds of the city below. Nina sat quietly in the chair near the window while Adrian stood near the kitchen counter reviewing messages on a secured device that appeared far more sophisticated than an ordinary phone. He did not rush. Whatever world he operated in, urgency did not mean panic. You have a very structured way of thinking, Adrian said without looking up. Nina folded her hands loosely together. Numbers tend to do that to people. You notice sequences. I notice inconsistencies, she corrected gently. Adrian glanced at her briefly. Inconsistencies often matter more. Nina considered everything she had observed that evening, replaying the timeline carefully in her mind. The arrival of the two men. The distance between them when they entered. The way one scanned exits while the other observed reflections. Their patience. Their confidence. They expected you to follow routine, she said. Which means they were certain of your schedule. Yes. Schedules like that are rarely public. No. Which narrows possibilities, Nina continued. Adrian placed the device on the counter and leaned slightly against the edge, arms loosely crossed. Go on, he said. The men at the restaurant weren't improvising, Nina said. They arrived early, positioned themselves carefully, and waited without hesitation. That suggests they knew exactly where you would be seated. Adrian nodded once. Table 12, he said. Your usual table. Yes. They didn't ask the host where you would sit, Nina continued. Which means they already knew. Adrian's gaze sharpened slightly. Someone familiar with the restaurant, he said. Or someone familiar with your habits, Nina replied. Adrian studied her expression, recognizing the careful logic behind her tone. You are building a profile, he observed. I'm narrowing variables, Nina said. Adrian allowed a faint hint of approval. Continue. Nina leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows lightly on her knees. They expected you to arrive at a predictable time, she said, which suggests observation over multiple visits. Yes, and they chose a weekday night, she added. Fewer witnesses, less attention. Adrian nodded slowly. That aligns, Nina continued carefully. They didn't try to approach you inside, she said. They waited for you to leave. Less risk, Adrian agreed. Cleaner outcome, Nina added. Adrian remained silent for a moment. You are comfortable discussing unpleasant possibilities, he said. I prefer honesty to surprise, Nina replied. He accepted that. What else? Adrian asked. Nina took a slow breath, organizing her thoughts. If they knew your routine, someone with access to your calendar, your habits, or your schedule shared that information. Yes, and that person expected to benefit from your absence, she said quietly. Adrian's expression remained controlled, but something colder moved beneath the calm surface. Motivation, he said. Exactly. Nina spoke carefully now, aware that she was entering territory she did not fully understand. People don't take risks like that without incentive, she said. Power, money, position, something changes hands. Adrian gave a small nod. You understand leverage. I understand consequences, Nina replied. Adrian stepped away from the counter, pacing once across the room before stopping near the window. Very few individuals know my movements precisely, he said, and fewer still could coordinate external actors, Nina added. Yes. He paused, then spoke more quietly. Internal betrayal requires opportunity. And trust, Nina said. Adrian's gaze shifted toward her again. Trust is expensive. So is betrayal, Nina replied. The rain continued tapping steadily against the glass. Nina thought back to small details she had noticed over the past few weeks at the restaurant. There was someone, she said slowly. Adrian turned slightly. Someone? A man who met with you twice last month, Nina said. He didn't eat much, mostly spoke. Adrian's attention sharpened immediately. You remember him? Yes. Description? Mid-40s, Nina said. Always paid cash, never drank alcohol, watched people when he thought they weren't looking. Adrian's expression remained neutral, but his silence suggested recognition. He asked unusual questions, Nina added. What kind of questions? About staffing schedules, she said. How late the kitchen stayed open, whether reservations changed often. Adrian absorbed that carefully. You remember this clearly. He stood out, Nina said. Why? He listened more than he spoke, Nina said. And he watched exits. Adrian's jaw tightened slightly. Victor Hale, he said quietly. The name seemed to carry weight. You trust him? Nina asked gently. I did, Adrian replied. The past tense did not go unnoticed. Nina continued cautiously. He seemed interested in routine, she said. People who study routine usually plan to use it. Adrian nodded slowly. Yes. Nina hesitated briefly before continuing. Tonight's timing suggests coordination, she said, which suggests communication. Adrian picked up the secure device again, reviewing something on the screen. Victor manages financial structures, he said quietly. Meaning? He sees patterns in movement. Nina allowed a small breath of understanding. Then he would know when routine becomes predictable. Yes. And predictable systems can be exploited. Yes. Adrian placed the device down again. If he believed removing me created opportunity, he said, then he miscalculated one variable. Nina tilted her head slightly. Which variable? Adrian looked at her directly. You. Nina gave a small exhale. I doubt I was part of the original equation. No, Adrian agreed. You were not. Silence settled briefly between them. People often ignore what they consider unimportant, Nina said. And sometimes that becomes their weakness, Adrian replied. Nina nodded. Being underestimated can be useful. Yes. Adrian moved toward the window again, watching rain trace uneven lines down the glass. If Victor is involved, he will attempt to confirm outcome, he said. He will want proof, Nina agreed. Yes. Which means he will reveal movement soon, she added. Adrian turned slightly. You think he will act quickly? Yes, Nina said. Because uncertainty creates risk. Adrian gave a quiet nod. You think clearly. I think cautiously. That may be why we are both still alive tonight, Adrian said. Nina allowed a faint smile. I was thinking the same thing. Adrian checked the time. If Victor believes tonight succeeded, he said, he will meet with interested parties soon. Celebration creates visibility, Nina said. And visibility creates opportunity. Adrian agreed. Nina stood slowly. You'll want confirmation before acting. Yes. You'll need someone unnoticed. Adrian regarded her carefully. You are suggesting involvement again. I am suggesting practicality. Nina corrected gently. You have already done enough, Adrian said. Have I? Nina asked quietly. Adrian did not answer immediately, because they both understood something had already changed. The situation had moved beyond coincidence, beyond chance. Someone had attempted to rewrite Adrian's future, and Nina Walker, who had spent years perfecting invisibility, had become the one variable no one had planned for. The city looked different after midnight, quieter but not asleep. From the window of the safe apartment, the streets below appeared almost peaceful, yet Nina understood that silence often meant decisions were being made elsewhere. Adrian had changed into a simple dark jacket that blended easily into any crowd. Nothing about his appearance suggested wealth or authority now. Just another man moving through a late evening. You don't have to come, he said calmly as he checked the small communication device resting on the table. And let you walk into a room without knowing who's waiting? Nina replied gently. That sounds inefficient. Adrian studied her expression, searching for hesitation. You understand this could become unpredictable, he said. It already has, Nina answered. He nodded slightly, accepting the logic. The Sapphire Room is private, Adrian said. Discreet clientele. Staff trained not to ask questions, which makes it ideal for conversations people don't want overheard, Nina said. Yes, and predictable for someone celebrating a promotion, she added. Adrian gave a faint nod. Victor prefers environments where loyalty can be observed, he said. And displayed, Nina replied. Adrian handed her a small earpiece no larger than a pearl. Audio only, he explained. Minimal signal footprint. Nina examined it briefly before placing it carefully in her ear. Technology has improved since my accounting classes, she said lightly. Adrian allowed the smallest hint of a smile. You adapt quickly. I pay attention. Adrian opened a garment bag resting on the back of the chair and removed a simple black vest and white blouse identical to those worn by service staff in many upscale lounges. You will not stand out, he said. That's usually my specialty, Nina replied. She changed quickly, tying her hair neatly at the nape of her neck in a style common among hospitality staff. When she stepped back into the room, her reflection revealed exactly what she intended. Forgettable professionalism. Perfect, Adrian said quietly. That's not usually a compliment, Nina replied. Tonight it is. They left the apartment separately. Adrian first, exiting through the underground garage. Nina followed 10 minutes later using a different route that connected to a quiet pedestrian street lined with dimly lit storefronts. The Sapphire Room occupied the second floor of a restored historic building overlooking the river. From the outside, the establishment appeared understated, its entrance marked only by a polished brass plaque and a doorman who acknowledged guests with discreet familiarity. Nina entered through the service door at the side of the building, carrying an empty tray she had borrowed from the safe apartment's storage area. Inside, the atmosphere differed from La Rosa Grigio but shared the same language of quiet luxury. Low lighting, muted music, soft conversations spoken by people accustomed to privacy. No one questioned her presence. Staff uniforms blended into the environment as naturally as shadows. You're in. Adrian's voice came softly through the earpiece. Yes, she murmured. Stay near the main corridor. Understood. Nina moved through the lounge calmly, her posture professional but unremarkable. She observed details without appearing to observe anything at all. Crystal glasses arranged precisely on lacquered trays. Soft laughter from a corner table where older men discussed investments. A couple seated near the window speaking quietly about travel plans. The private rooms were located toward the back of the lounge, separated by a narrow corridor monitored by a single security attendant who appeared more interested in discretion than confrontation. Nina paused near a service station, lifting 2 empty glasses from a nearby table. There are 3 occupied private rooms, she whispered softly. Any familiar faces? Adrian asked. Not yet. She continued forward slowly, careful not to rush. The corridor lighting was dim enough to obscure detailed facial recognition from a distance, but Nina recognized posture before identity. Room 1, voices older, relaxed. Room 2, empty. Room 3, partially open door. Inside room 3, she heard a familiar tone of voice. Victor Hale, I have visual confirmation, Nina said quietly. How many with him, Adrian asked. 3 men, she replied. 2 security. Armed? Likely. Nina adjusted the tray slightly, angling her position to gain a clearer view through the reflection of a polished wall panel. Victor sat comfortably, leaning back in his chair with the relaxed posture of someone who believed the evening had gone exactly as planned. He's not worried, Nina added softly. Of course not, Adrian replied. Drinks on the table, she continued. Expensive bottle. Celebration, Adrian said. Yes. Nina allowed a guest to pass before continuing down the corridor, maintaining the illusion of purposeful movement. He seems comfortable, she said. That suggests confidence, Adrian replied. Or ignorance, Nina added. Both are useful. As Nina turned slightly to return toward the main lounge, the security attendant near the corridor gave her a brief glance. She lowered her gaze politely and continued walking. Stay in public space, Adrian said quietly. I'm near the main bar. Good. Nina placed the empty glasses beside other used items waiting for collection, blending seamlessly into the rhythm of staff activity. Moments later, she saw Victor step partially into the corridor, speaking quietly with one of his guards. His expression showed no concern, only satisfaction. He believes you are no longer a problem, Nina whispered. That assumption will not last, Adrian replied calmly. Victor laughed softly at something one of the men inside the room had said. The sound carried easily through the partially open door. It sounds like relief, Nina observed. Relief often lowers caution, Adrian said. Yes. The security attendant moved briefly to assist another guest, leaving the corridor momentarily less monitored. Opportunity. He is alone in the hallway now, Nina whispered. Position confirmed, Adrian replied. Nina picked up another empty glass, moving naturally toward the corridor once more. She allowed the glass to slip gently from her tray. Crystal shattered against the polished floor, the sharp sound cutting through conversation nearby. Guests turned instinctively toward the noise. The security attendant moved forward immediately, attention diverted. Victor stepped into the hallway fully, irritation visible in his expression as he assessed the disturbance. I'm so sorry, Nina said softly, bending quickly as though embarrassed by the mistake. No harm done, Victor said distractedly. He barely looked at her. Invisible. Exactly as expected. Through the earpiece, Adrian's voice remained calm. Move away. Nina stepped aside, allowing space in the corridor. Within seconds, movement shifted behind Victor. Adrian emerged from the secondary exit with controlled precision. Victor turned too late to adjust. Shock replaced confidence. Realization followed instantly. Some miscalculations could not be corrected. Nina did not remain long enough to witness the full confrontation. She moved calmly back toward the main lounge, blending once more into the quiet rhythm of unnoticed service staff. Behind her, the balance of power was being rewritten. Justice, she realized, rarely announced itself. It simply arrived when the truth could no longer remain hidden. Nina did not run when she left the Sapphire Room. Running would have drawn attention, and attention was exactly what she had spent years learning to avoid. Instead, she walked with the same measured pace she had used throughout the evening, carrying an empty tray as though her only concern was clearing forgotten glasses. Behind her, muted voices rose briefly in confusion before settling again into controlled quiet, the kind of quiet that did not invite questions. By the time she reached the service exit, the cool night air felt sharper than before. The rain had slowed to a faint mist, soft enough to blur streetlights into halos of gold. She stepped outside and moved 2 blocks away before stopping beneath the awning of a closed bookstore. Her heartbeat, steady until now, began to quicken as adrenaline slowly loosened its grip. For several minutes, nothing happened. Cars passed occasionally. A couple laughed quietly as they crossed the street, unaware of how much had changed in the last hour. Somewhere in the distance, a siren sounded briefly before fading into the hum of the city. Then Adrian appeared from the shadows across the street, walking with the same controlled calm he carried everywhere. His jacket was slightly damp from the mist, but his posture remained unchanged. It's done, he said quietly as he approached. Nina exhaled a breath she had not realized she had been holding. "You're all right," she said. "Yes." She studied his expression carefully. No visible injury, no sign of urgency, just certainty. "He was surprised?" she asked. "Yes. I imagine that doesn't happen often." "No," Adrian replied. They stood in silence for a moment, the significance of the evening settling between them. Victor Hale had made one mistake. He assumed predictability. He assumed routine. He assumed invisibility meant irrelevance. Nina wrapped her arms lightly against the cool air. "I suppose that means your schedule changes now," she said gently. "For a while," Adrian agreed. "And your trust. That as well." They began walking slowly toward a quieter side street where fewer lights remained on. "You were correct," Adrian said after a moment. "About what?" "Betrayal rarely complicates itself," he replied. "It usually follows incentive." Nina nodded slightly. "People justify things when they believe they deserve more." "Yes. And sometimes they believe removing an obstacle creates opportunity." Adrian gave a faint nod. "Victor believed absence created advancement. And instead it revealed intention," Nina said. "Yes." They reached the corner where a black sedan waited quietly. Adrian opened the passenger door again, but Nina did not enter immediately. "What happens now?" she asked. "Transition," Adrian said. "That sounds complicated." "It usually is." Nina considered that. "You won't remain visible for a while," she said. "No. And anyone associated with tonight may also attract attention." "Yes." Nina nodded slowly. "That includes me." Adrian did not deny it. "Yes," he said. She appreciated the honesty. "I assumed that when I dropped the glass," she said lightly. Adrian allowed a small breath of amusement. "You created effective timing." "I've dropped worse things during dinner rush," Nina replied. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a small envelope and a single key. "This is not payment," he said calmly, offering them to her. "I didn't ask for payment." "I know." Nina accepted the envelope but did not open it immediately. "What is it?" she asked. "Opportunity," Adrian said. "Relocation assistance. Education funding if you choose to return to accounting." Nina looked at the key. "Akar?" "Yes. That seems excessive for noticing two nervous men." "You did more than notice," Adrian said. Nina met his gaze calmly. "I did what anyone should do. Most would not. That doesn't make it extraordinary." Adrian studied her expression, recognizing the quiet certainty in her tone. "You changed the outcome of tonight," he said. "I changed timing," Nina corrected. "Timing often determines outcome." She considered that. "What about you?" she asked. "I adapt," Adrian replied. "You always speak in very efficient sentences." "I find efficiency useful." Nina smiled faintly. "I suppose it has kept you alive." "Usually." She opened the envelope slightly, enough to see official documents bearing her name already prepared. "You move quickly," she observed. "I prepare early," Adrian replied. "That sounds exhausting." "It becomes habit." Nina closed the envelope again. "I don't want to disappear," she said quietly. "You don't have to. I don't want to spend my life wondering who might be watching." "That is understandable." She considered the key resting in her hand. "I left accounting because life interrupted," she said slowly. "You may return if you choose." "I might," she admitted. Adrian nodded once. "You notice patterns," he said. "That skill has value beyond restaurants." Nina exhaled softly. "I used to believe that." "You should again." They stood quietly for a moment beneath the soft glow of the streetlight. "This is where our paths separate," Adrian said finally. "That sounds very formal." "It is practical." Nina studied his expression carefully. "You saved your own life tonight," she said. "You made that possible." She shook her head slightly. "You made the decisions. And you provided the information." Nina slipped the key into her coat pocket. "I hope your future schedules are less complicated," she said. Adrian allowed the faintest hint of a smile. "I suspect they will not be." "That figures." She stepped back slightly. "Take care of yourself, Mr. Marino." "Adrian," he corrected gently. She nodded once. "Take care of yourself, Adrian." He hesitated briefly, as though considering something unsaid. "You will not be entirely alone," he said quietly. "That sounds mysterious." "It is reassurance." "I'll accept reassurance," Nina replied. Adrian stepped back toward the sedan. As he opened the door, he paused briefly. "You were right about something else," he said. "What's that?" "Invisible does not mean powerless." Nina smiled softly. I'm beginning to understand that. He inclined his head once before entering the car. Moments later, the vehicle moved quietly down the street, disappearing into the city's late-night rhythm. Nina remained standing beneath the streetlight for a few seconds longer, feeling the weight of the envelope in her hand and the unfamiliar sense that something in her life had shifted permanently. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, like most meaningful changes. Some encounters lasted only hours but altered direction completely. Some lessons arrived disguised as coincidence, and sometimes, being overlooked allowed a person to see clearly enough to change their own future. Nina Walker turned toward the opposite corner and began walking home, aware that routine would feel different tomorrow, not because the world had changed, but because she had. The story reminds us that strength does not always appear in loud voices or powerful positions. Sometimes the people society overlooks are the ones who see the truth most clearly. Nina's courage shows that dignity and integrity matter more than status, and that quiet decisions can change the course of lives. Justice is not always dramatic or visible, but it often begins with one person choosing to do what is right, even when no one is watching. The lesson is simple yet powerful. Never underestimate the value of awareness, moral courage, and self-respect, because true influence often belongs to those who act with conscience rather than fear. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real, and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.